simply as Gautam said, but a little bit about fair dealings under our copyright law. And before all this, let me just make one point. What Sudhir spoke about as plagiarism, well, it applies to Wikipedia. There's no law on plagiarism. It's just an ethical code, and copyright, on the other hand, is law. And but a couple of things that I find interesting is that while most citations have a number within a square bracket, but there's also something else on Wikipedia. It says citation needed within square brackets, and I'm sure many of you would have seen this XKCD comic strip where an audience member at a public lecture is holding up a placard that says citation needed. So it's permeated popular culture in many ways, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know, because in many ways previous generations quite possibly did not have this veneration that we have of citation, of necessarily tracing everything back. And even current generations don't apply this all that much outside of an academic enterprise, which Wikipedia is in a sense. So in the world of art, for instance, the idea of plagiarism is very different. And if time permits, right at the very end, I'll be talking. I'll give an example of Wikipedia art as well. But
can I just ask you a quick question? So Wikipedia's academic community is self-identity, or do they self-identify?
I'm just talking about it as an encyclopedia, like an activity towards constructing an encyclopedia, which in a sense is academic activity or a scholarly enterprise, right? So I'll just begin with a little bit of general possible critiques of copyright. So we have criticism by economists, by cultural theorists, by political economists, both from the left and the right, and legal philosophers of the copyright system that we have right now. And a lot of those look at many of the underlying assumptions behind copyright law. So they look at the idea of authorship as ownership. They look at the idea of intangibles as commodities. So the very idea of something that is intellectual, that is intangible, being property, which normally we associate with something that is tangible. And they focus on the narrow view that copyright law has of authorship, in a sense claiming that the last one in what Sudhir was talking about earlier, if someone puts together lots of things in a kind of mixture and brings together many arguments in one article, then that person is the author and the owner of that, not all the people from which he or she drew the ideas. So this narrow view of authorship, and the problem of viewing copyright as an incentive model to incentivize people to create something new, when you have an incredibly long copyright term that extends even after that person is dead and can't create any new copyright work, copyrightable works. So that kind of mismatch, whereas originally copyright would have existed for around 14 years. And now a lot of scholarship has emerged by looking at digital technologies, because they help us question a lot of these assumptions that go beneath copyright, that are the foundation of copyright law. So digital technologies, for instance, enable us to have an encyclopedia that is edited by millions of people. Now, can you imagine a book, a non-digital book, being written by say more than 10? No, an editor puts together what 10 people contribute separately as chapters. But can you imagine one chapter being written offline by more than, say, 2 or 3 people? Now, that is what copyright was created for, right? Where a single person, more or less, would be creating a work. And you have so many cases about joint authorship that are completely messed up because copyright doesn't clearly, in most cases, even think about works that for instance, a very famous case in India is one of someone transcribing what a famous personality said. Now, who owns that copyright when the transcriber would, put in their own thoughts as well? So these kinds of questions are very complicated, and copyright law just isn't equipped to answer them. It was created primarily to regulate the printing press. So that's just a bit of an opening to a critique of copyright law. Some clarifications about the law itself. Now, everything that is a literary work, a dramatic work, artistic, so photographs included, musical work, or is a sound recording, which is separate from a musical work, confusingly enough, or is a video, is copyrighted. By default, it is copyrighted. So from the moment it is put down on paper, or on disc, or on film, or on tape, or just converted to bits, it is copyrighted. You don't need to go anywhere and register it. You don't need to you don't have to put a seed with a circle, within a circle. You don't need to do any of that. The moment it is created, it is copyrighted. Now, this is, in my opinion, very unfortunate because a default setting of copyright law, which is that those who wanted to assert copyright could, because they wanted to make money out of it, and those who didn't, wouldn't. Okay, and since the number of people who wanted to assert copyright is normally less, okay, the number of people who write blogs and don't really do anything commercial out of it, and the number of people who write blogs, say Annie Zaida, and who convert it into a book known TERF, okay, are similarly less, right? So the number of people who write blogs are now, unfortunately, within this, who write blogs without any intention of making money out of that, are covered by the same system that those people who want to make money out of it are covered by default. And it doesn't really give you any kind of flexibility. So if you want to say that, wait a second, I'm not really in this for the money, there are so many other things that motivate me, okay, then you have to proactively disclose that. And how you can do that is something that Dinesh will be talking about. And one other clarification, because I see this coming up numerous times, is that the way we use public domain normally, which is to mean something that isn't secret, something that is known, something that is public, something that I can see on a website. And the way the phrase public domain is used within a copyright framework, which is to mean something that is not copyrighted or something that is out of copyright, something to which copyright law does not apply, are not equivalent. They're very different. And this is something that keeps coming up over and over again. This is confusion that I've seen government officials have, because one of the responses that I had when talking to a government official, to 2 government officials recently, and about the problem that was raised about government data needing to have an open copyright regime was, but it's public. It is, the government's put it out. It's public. And I said, but it's not public domain. Of course it is public domain. You can go to our website. You can see it. But that isn't public domain when it comes to copyright, because in India all government works are copyrighted. By default, they are copyrighted, and the exceptions are very restricted. So that's the other thing that I wanted to cover. Now, I'm just going to be talking a little bit about the fair dealings exception in India. So just to clarify what I mean by exceptions, there are basically three kinds of limits or exceptions, as you could call it, to copyright law. So there are the limitations, which is the stuff that isn't protected by the law, right? Stuff that the law explicitly says doesn't come within the framework of this. And we must realize that copyright has evolved radically over the years. So a photograph, for instance, which you might think is just mechanical reproduction, right? The person who's put up something in a building of architecture is the person who should be getting the rights, not the person who clicks a photo of it. You're just clicking something that exists. Whereas the creativity in it. And that for a long time was the argument used to deny photographs copyright. So the way we know copyright law right now is not the way it existed. For instance, translations take a large amount of creativity. So you're not just doing some like using machine to just translate each word. You're thinking about what the original means, and you're changing it completely. And for those who think seriously about the fact that copyright is meant to protect only expressions and not the idea, could possibly think that translations shouldn't come within copyright law. And indeed, at one point of time, they didn't. And now, under most countries, copyright law, translations do. And they are the right of the original author and not the person who creates the translation. Right? So only the original author has or rather the original copyright owner, has the right to create a translation. So there are limitations, there are exceptions. That is the stuff which is protected by copyright law, but the doing of which the law says is not infringement. Okay, so fair dealings, which I'll be talking about, are squarely within that. There are exceptions. And then the third, and these are free. You don't need to pay to make use of these exceptions. Then there are compulsory and statutory licenses, which are basically stuff that is protected by copyright law, but which the law says that I have a right to use as long as I pay money. How much money is dependent on whether it's a compulsory license or a statutory license, and there are different ways that laws look at that. But it is stuff that I have to pay money for. So cover versions are one such thing. Certain kinds of exceptions in developing in India for translating works that, despite having been 7 years since it was published elsewhere, hasn't been introduced to India, etc., etc. That's and which Sudhir also referred to briefly. That's a compulsory license. Okay, so you have a right under copyright law to go to the government, or in case of cover versions, to just release a cover recording and to pay that person. Okay, so that person can't say no, that you don't have a right, that I have that absolute right, that I can tell you not to make any kinds of change, right? And now one thought experiment that I would ask each one of you to think about this question. Instead of an exception for libraries, which many laws contain, imagine that copyright law sought an exception to protect an organization that buys a single copy of a work, that distributes it to thousands of people, many of whom don't pay any money, and even if they pay, the original author doesn't get the money, the organization gets the money. Do you think it is possible at all that such an organization could receive protection of the law?
Bible.
Sorry?
Bible.
Well, I'm thinking about any kind of, so not just a book such as the Bible, which is not copyrighted, but which is out of copyright rather, but any kind of organization that allows thousands of people to take a single copy of a work. Now, that I don't think would pass. Like, copyright owners would be up in arms. Yet, because historically we've had libraries before copyright law got strict, we allow such an exception. Which is, if you think about it, it is ridiculous. How could possibly copyright owners have, allow for this, right? So, a lot of copyright law that way is very historical, including the exceptions to copyright law. Things which have existed for a long while continue to exist, and you ensure, and copyright owners have ensured that in the past around 50 years that they haven't allowed for any kind of expansion of these exceptions, whereas the only expansion we've seen are of the rights governed by copyright law. So it's only been a one-sided expansion of copyright law. Now, Section 14 of the Indian Copyright Act, which defines copyright, says that copyright means the exclusive right to do acts in respect of a work or any substantial part thereof. Lawyerly language, yes, but basically it says that anything that is insubstantial copying or insubstantial doing these things, okay, which Sudhir spoke about, distribution, copying, etc., that doing that with an insubstantial portion of a work wouldn't attract the penalties of copyright law. So those aren't covered at all. Okay, so you don't have the exclusive right to say that that you see in some places online, etc., saying 15. If you take more than 15 words of this, okay, you can't. Or saying if you take more than 50 words of this in a 50,000 word book, okay, that you can't. They don't have a right at all. Okay, so they can't enforce that. You don't have to rely on an exception, okay, to say that this is an exception. That is not covered by copyright law, period. Now, and that's also called a de minimis, the de minimis principle. Now, what goes under the idea of fair use in the US, I'll describe that very briefly before coming to the Indian law, because quite strangely, because of the way the internet and the World Wide Web are, you often get to learn more about the US law, and on online discussions you keep hearing about the US law and assuming that the Indian law is very similar, whereas they're different. So I'll just describe what the US law says. So it's a judge-made exception. Okay, different decisions carved out these exceptions to copyright law in the US, and eventually in the 60s the government codified those exceptions into 4 principles, and it's Section 107 of the US Copyright Act. So it says that any kind of use, you'll judge by these 4 parameters to see whether it is fair use or not. And if it is fair use, that isn't infringement. So what are the 4 parameters? 1, the purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is commercial or is for a non-profit educational purpose. 2, the nature of the copyrighted work. 3, the amount and substantiality of the portion used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. And 4, the effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. Okay, so these are the 4 broad parameters. They don't say, for instance, that anything done for educational purposes is fine, or that anything done for private use is fine. But they've been read in different ways, sometimes very expansively, to say that a transformative use doesn't infringe upon the potential market or value of the original work. So a transformative use, which is what, say, Google Images, okay, which has a smaller thumbnail of the original, right? It's been litigated, and judges found that that's a transformative use, that it is allowed. So, and in India, we have section 52(1)(a), which talks about how something that, I'll read it out, except that I don't have it in front of me right now. And, but it basically has a wide exception and says that the following things are not infringement, and includes in that fair dealing for the purposes of private use, including research. 2. Criticism or review, whether of that work or any other work. Okay, so before 1994, this private use exception used to be the private study exception, and then in the statement of objects of the new amendment, they said it could be read very restrictively, so we're actually going to change it to private use. And now there's a new amendment on the tables to make this private or personal use, including research. Okay, so some people are of the opinion that even, for instance, peer-to-peer sharing, or rather peer-to-peer downloading at least, would be covered by this. The sharing part might be different, but downloading an entire copy of a copyrighted work might, according to some progressive lawyers, and this is not an opinion that everyone shares, let me just warn you, could possibly come under this depending on circumstances. Now, this becomes very complicated when you try and apply it to something like Wikipedia. When you try and apply it, forget about Wikipedia, when you try and apply it to anything beyond the narrow imagination of copyright law. So if you try and apply it to the view that many people who use aren't just using for personal consumption, we're also using for production. Right? So when you try and apply the word private, okay, with the word use, you have an apparent contradiction there, possibly especially when it comes to digital technologies. So there are no resolutions, so I am not going to provide you any bright lines that says that this is okay and this is not, because it's just not possible. But there are many of the problems that they have in other countries aren't problems here. So this, I would say, quite clearly covers the act of recording something that is streaming off the internet. It quite clearly covers that. Whereas in the US and the UK, people went to court saying that recording, actually not recording, that VCRs, for those of you old enough to remember what those are, that VCRs should be declared illegal. And they didn't succeed in the US, but they succeeded in the UK. So in the UK, technically, VCRs are not legal. That private copying exception, as we have it, the broad private copying exception, doesn't exist in the UK. And that's a big problem. So what we have often is a law that exists on paper, but no one follows. So imagine traffic lights that nobody follows at all. And that's what you have. And yet you insist on saying that the traffic lights are the ideal, that's what should be, and everyone should be punished. Now, what if we thought about a different system, a non-traffic light based system that'll be easier to follow, that accomplishes the same objectives as this? Now, that is a very difficult thing to do, not because it's not because it's impossible, but it's a difficult thing to do because at the research level it's fine, but so many policymakers are just so scared because they know the old, and whether it has value or not, they still have the comfort of knowing that it's there. Whereas anything new, they don't know. And so in the 1960s, in an article about photocopying and whether photocopiers should be legal or not, this is precisely what the author, who went on to become a judge in the US, said that we have no clear evidence that the copyright law system actually works. But we would be too scared that it's not possible to abandon the system because we don't know what would happen then. Okay, so that's where we're kind of stuck. Now, questions that this doesn't answer, what is fair dealing? What does that phrase mean? So fair dealing for purposes of etc., etc., etc. are fine, but what is that fair dealing? Now, some have said that that would possibly incorporate parts of the U.S. law, or because those are well understood into Indian law, but we don't really know what exactly fair dealing will have and what it. We have certain ideas about what it won't have because we have cases, but we don't know what all it will have, what that fair dealing encompasses. So questions such as digitization by libraries, by universities, by say lawyers or research institution or by Wikipedians, is that covered? The law doesn't really tell us. One thing, because it was raised, I will quickly cover. How much more time do I have? Okay, one other thing I'll quickly cover is the issue of journalism and coverage of current affairs, etc. So we have currently a few different provisions that try and cover what is done by journalism. So historically, the way it's been is that journalists want a large exception to be able to carry on the work that they do without being boggled by copyright law. Because you can imagine if every single article that they write, it's almost certain that the majority of the articles they write will impinge on some copyrighted issue, thing or the other, and that has serious implications for freedom of speech. So this is also somewhere where the thing of stealing people's photos also comes in, because that part of law, I would actually say it isn't so very clear. I'm not sure it's stealing. And copyright infringement, we should all remember, is just that. It's copyright infringement. That we shouldn't really think about it as theft. Okay, we should think about it in terms of the law, which is infringement. And I'm not sure in those cases it is necessarily copyright infringement, because I'll just read out some of the provisions that cover this. So. Under the new proposed amendment to the copyright law, and which will come up this time in Parliament, the reporting of current events, including the reporting of a lecture delivered in public, will come within the same fair dealings system that I just told you about. So one is private use, including research, the other is for review and criticism, then this would be a third. The existing system was that there was a separate section B, which is fair dealings with the literary, dramatic, musical, or artistic work for the purposes of reporting current events in a newspaper, magazine, or similar periodical. B, by broadcast or in a cinematograph film or by means of photographs. Okay, so the difference is that now the requirement of in a newspaper, magazine, or similar periodical is no longer really there, or if this amendment goes through as it is, won't be there. So it'll apply to a larger set, including Wikipedia. So I see that as a positive amendment. Okay, so Wikinews will quite clearly be covered by this. And earlier there was a section 52(1)(m), which is now being removed, which talks about the reproduction in a newspaper, magazine, or other periodical of an article on current economic, political, social, or religious topics, unless the author of such article has expressly reserved to himself the right of such reproduction.